Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116, and this is for class for Monday, December 8th, where I wanted to introduce the idea of poetry now that we've watched Dead Poets Society. And I teach two versions of this class, a face-to-face and an online class. So we didn't get as far in my face-to-face class as I had hoped, so I'm going to make sure that we are at the same place as my face-to-face class. So today's video will end a little bit early just so that both classes are in the same place. And in terms of thinking about poetry, I started with Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? But of course, we watched Dead Poets Society, and it's a wonderful film, and in my opinion, and with a lot of foreshadowing that you might have noticed, or perhaps you didn't notice. Now, while you wouldn't necessarily be writing a paper on Dead Poets Society, because paper number 2 is going to be devoted to one of the dramas, so you would be writing about either Oedipus, Midsummer, or Raisin in the Sun. You will have the opportunity to write about either Dead Poets Society or one of the poems we are studying in class in our poetry section. Keep in mind the exam is open book and open notes. An essay exam won't be anywhere as detailed or as neat or polished, I'm assuming, that compared to a paper, and I don't expect it to be. I'm just asking that you can synthesize some of the ideas, and obviously there are a lot of elements that are in that are in Dead Poets Society. Some even you might see parallels with A Raisin in the Sun. The idea of generational conflict, for instance, is something that we can see between Neil and his father. And notice how in those last scenes, we have all kinds of imagery about how his father is the exact opposite of Neil. His father is the one who has his slippers right by the bedside, who makes sure that he always wears his robe, that is always appropriate, in other words, as opposed to Neil at the ending of the play. He is barefoot, he is shirtless. Of course, he's looking out a window, and we know that windows represent freedom. And the major conflict between the father and the son is one of the many elements of the particular film. In fact, some have even argued that the main conflict between the father and the son is an unstated concern about a queer relationship between Neil and, if not Todd, then the possibility of someone else. And we aren't given a lot of information about that, and much like this upcoming sonnet that I'm going to talk about, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, where sometimes too it's raised questions about queer subtext. In the end, all we have is the actual text itself, so it seems to be a bit of a stretch, but nevertheless, the idea of balance, which I have suggested is perhaps the major theme of all pieces of literature, is definitely illustrated in Dead Poets Society. Yes, Carpe Diem seize the day, but do it intelligently and do it in a politic way. In other words, having a call from God, which was one scene in the film, is not necessarily the best way to proceed with that. And certainly, Neil's response is not the best way to respond to that. The film tries to lighten things up by giving us that wonderful final scene where you've got Todd's character who's really able to come into his own and declare that John Keating, which is a play on John Keats, the great romantic poet, by the way, that the idea of carpe diem and oh captain, my captain, and we see several members in the class follow suit. The idea that this is a transformative experience, hopefully in a positive way, not necessarily in a negative way, for the students that are in the class, unlike Neil. But certainly, this film is unusual in many respects. Usually, a film is based on a book, and the idea is that the screenplay came out first, and then a book was written on it. Robin Williams reportedly ad-libbed many of the lines, so there are scenes where he's teaching and the students are laughing. Those are genuine things that he would have ad-libbed. He's known for being a master of ad-lib, just a genius talent. And Robin Williams is also a student of Juilliard or a graduate of Juilliard and was Shakespearean trained. And I think you can get a sense of that in his performance, which is really multi layered in Dead Poets Society. We know that the fall, which is where the story begins, is oftentimes representative of dissent or change. And then we know that the winter is oftentimes representative of the ending of life, which is when Neil ultimately ends his life. And even something as simple as the mother smoking a cigarette where she's waiting for Neil and the father to come home after Neil's play performance. We see the smoke of the cigarette, and then later on, of course, we will see the smoke of the gun that Neil uses to commit suicide. The way the film is able to build tension with Neil in front of the window, and we think that he's going to jump, but instead he finds another way to commit suicide with his father's own weapon, no less, which I think is somewhat significant. And the idea that this is not your typical Hollywood ending where there is a happily ever after. It's mixed. Life is mixed and complex. And certainly, this film that came out in 1989, there are places that will raise eyebrows. I know the film is supposed to take place in the late 1950s, early 1960s, so it's a very different world, but the objectification of women, for instance, the idea of appropriating another culture, the very classist and very in one way very undiverse viewpoint of a boys prep school also would raise eyebrows in today's world. But outside of that, I still think that it is an excellent film, if for no other reason. It poses the question of what is poetry, and that perhaps it's more than what a J.R. Pritchard would say, that it's not something necessarily that can be objectively measured. A lot of it is about feeling and emotion and passion. And I think we will see that with the upcoming poems that I've selected, just a handful because we're towards the ending of the semester. But I selected poems that in one way represent a particular style or a particular author. And the first being a classic poem, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, Shakespearean sonnet. Now, a sonnet usually is a very strict kind of writing style, which is what we talked about with The Sorrowful Woman, that she was contemplating writing a sonnet and then realized that she had much more freedom, which basically reinforced some of the themes in the short story. Sonnet, and usually by that we mean a Shakespearean sonnet. There are other kinds of sonnets, but usually if somebody's mentioning a sonnet, they mean a Shakespearean sonnet. They mean something that's 14 lines long. They mean something that has a particular rhyme scheme or pattern, which is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and then the final two lines are a couplet. It's known if they both rhyme together, and that's a GG. And again, we look at the last word of each line to determine a rhyme scheme or pattern, and we use the letters of the alphabet to indicate a new rhyme. And Shakespeare wrote over 100 of these. It's thought that he wrote most of them during times of plague when the theater houses were shut down. And the sonnets have been divided by scholars into two groups. None of the sonnets are titled, so they are referenced by either their first name, or first line, I should say, or by their number. Scholars have grouped them into two separate groups. The earlier set of sonnets that are thought to have been written to a young man, probably Shakespeare's patron, perhaps the Earl of Southampton. And then the later set of sonnets thought to have been written to someone known as a dark lady, someone with dark features, not necessarily a dark hair, dark eyes, dark hair, or dark, not necessarily dark skin, but dark features, dark eyes, dark hair. Think Hermia, if you will, of A Midsummer Night's Dream. And the speculation is that this woman, this dark lady, is someone that Shakespeare was at the very least infatuated with and at the most was having an active affair with. And the sonnet that I selected for us is perhaps Shakespeare's most famous sonnet and also Shakespeare's most misunderstood sonnet. Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? And this does follow, as all the sonnets do, the formula for a sonnet. It is 14 lines long. Day rhymes with May. Temperate rhymes with date. Shines rhymes with declines. Dimmed rhymes with untrimmed. Fade rhymes with shade. Owest rhymes with growest. And C and thee rhyme together. And we also have a 10 syllable line. So, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? All of the lines will be 10 syllables long, so that's the meter. And it's talking about a subject that's considered to be lofty, important, such as love or death or beauty. It's not supposed to talk about the commonplace. And I have Sir Patrick Stewart reading this particular song. I'm going to ask you to listen to him read it. He actually had quite the project during the early days of COVID when we were all on lockdown, where he decided to record and upload a sonnet a day, thinking that the lockdown would basically outlived the sonnets, and that's or thinking that the sonnets would outlive the lockdown, and the exact opposite happened. So in his last sonnet, he was dressed in a tuxedo with a glass of champagne. You might know him from perhaps Star Trek The Next Generation, which is his biggest claim to fame as an actor, I suppose. But Sir Patrick Stewart is also Shakespearean trained, and I think you can tell that in his reading of the sonnet, which was very low tech. Again, these were the days of lockdown, so he would have done this in his living room, and he was filmed by his wife on her cell phone. But no one can read like Patrick Stewart can read. And when you see this performance, he talks a little bit about the background of the sonnet, which is written to a young man. It's part of the early set of sonnets. So, this very famous sonnet is oftentimes viewed as a romantic sonnet that is written to a woman. But in fact, what it is that it is probably written as Shakespeare's patron. And this is not so much a romantic sonnet as it is a sonnet of flattery. And I just wanted to go through it with you when he asked the question of, shall I compare thee, which is you, the no pronouns are used that indicate gender, to a summer's day. And a summer's day is supposed to represent perfection. But the rest of the poem talks about all of the imperfections associated with summer. That summer is not temperate, it's not predictable the way this person is. In fact, this person is much more lovely than the summer because rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. In other words, it can be windy, and the darling buds of May are basically rosebuds or flower buds. And summer's lease hath all too short a date. That obviously summer is not infinite. I love the term of the use lease, which suggests that this is not owned. It's merely basically used for a particular period of time, but the ownership ultimately is belonging to God. Sometimes it's too hot, the eye of heaven shines, the eye of heaven being the sun, and sometimes the summertime is too hot. And often is his gold complexion dimmed, talking about the sun, that sometimes it can be cloudy. And of course, you might wonder, why didn't he just say the sun rather than the eye of heaven? Not only is it less poetic, but also we would lose our 10 syllable line if we did that. And every fair from fair, or every beautiful thing. Think of fairy tales, for instance. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all? And every fair from fair sometime declines by chance, or nature's changing course untrimmed. So all beauty experiences descent, either by chance, through accident, or through aging, which is nature's changing course untrimmed. But your eternal summer shall not fade. So talking about the subject of this poem has a summer that is everlasting. Nor shall lose possession of that fair or that beauty thou owest, and owest in this instance means possess. Nor shall death, notice death is capitalized, personifying it, brag thou wanderest in his shade. A long literary tradition of talking about death as a he. Maybe you might know the Grim Reaper. Also talking about the sun as a he and the moon as a she, as a feminine force. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade when eternal lines to time thou growest. In other words, this person will continue through to eternity. And then our last two lines, which almost serve as a kind of summary paragraph to tie things up. So long as men can breathe, their eyes can see. So long lives this, and this gives life to thee. In other words, as long as someone is alive, as long as men can breathe, their eyes can see, so long lives this poem. And the problem with that last line is that the this is an unclear pronoun reference. That this is a pronoun, but we aren't given the noun that it's replacing. But once I provide that noun, this poem or this sonnet, so long as this sonnet and this gives life to thee. In other words, this person is immortalized through verse, which is true because we're still talking about the subject of this poem. And while it is surprising, perhaps to some, that it was written to a young man, what's even more surprising about the poem is how bold Shakespeare is in suggesting that the power of immortality lies within the hands of the poet, specifically Shakespeare himself. So there are two entities that can offer immortality. One is God and one is Shakespeare, according to this particular poet. But we know that ultimately Shakespeare would oftentimes be rather subversive in his writing and revolutionary in his writing. So this is not too surprising. But if you get nothing else out of this sonnet, do know that this sonnet was written to a young man, so scholars believe. And it is not a sexual sonnet, it's more a sonnet of flattery. And do listen to Sir Patrick Stewart read the sonnet from the show Folger Shakespeare, no less. We've talked about the Folger. The next poem that I had assigned is written in a style called Romantic poetry, which is what Dead Poets Society basically talked about, the great Romantic poets, the Byron, the Shelley, the Keats, and also Blake, William Blake. And I have to admit, I'm not the biggest fan of romantic poetry. And by romantic, I don't necessarily mean a relationship. And that's not what usually we mean when we talk about the romantics. We talk about the romantics of people who could celebrate nature and the natural world, and that the natural world oftentimes reflected the human world, and vice versa. And it's a very short poem, but yet I think it's quite telling in terms of the complexity of poetry. That, O rose, thou art sick. And of course, we had talked about the idea of rose imagery with Rose for Emily. This could be a literal rose because this is what romantic poetry is about. It's examining the natural world. And the invisible worm that flies in the night and the howling storm that attacks this rose could very easily be basically, in effect, an insect or another predator that is consuming the rose, the food chain. The death of one life leads to the nourishing of another. But the rose can also be symbolic. It could be suggestive of a woman who perhaps has, in one way or another, been deflowered. I use that term deliberately because roses are associated with flowers. Perhaps this is a woman that has lost her virginity, that the invisible worm is a phallic symbol, and that this is in reference to, if not a loss of virginity, perhaps an illicit affair, which would lead to the loss of her reputation, and has found out thy bed of crimson joy. And of course, beds are places where sexual activity occurs, but it could also be a flower bed, a rose bed. Perhaps rose is symbolic of society, and the invisible worm is some sort of disease or societal ill. Plague, for instance, or perhaps just corruption. So there's lots of different ways you could read this poem. And for the romantics, you want to remember that, because I know we're at the point of the semester where oftentimes you read poetry and you think, or any literature, you think it can't be what it says. It's got to mean something else. But it can indeed be what it says, in addition to being something else, which is what you should think about with the romantics. Certainly, the poem's tone is quite dark. You know, the reference to things like nighttime, the reference to things like crimson, which is a dark red, which could be in reference to a red rose, but could also be in reference to blood, which could occur during the breaking of a hymen, or perhaps it is also in reference to something that's illicit, like an illicit affair. Think about something like the Scarlet Letter, for instance. So the poem, A Sick Rose, or The Sick Rose, even though it's very short, just two stanzas, we had talked about stanzas are basically divisions, much like paragraphs. So you can see that there's a first stanza, and then there's a second stanza. And that ultimately both of these talk about the destruction of the rose through the invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm, which could be a literal storm, or it could also be suggestive of sexual activity or societal corruption. And one of the ways to think about any of the romantics is how the natural world really does reflect the human world, literally as well as symbolically, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to give The Sick Rose as an example of one of our poems. Um, as has sought out that dark secret love, whatever that dark secret love might happen to be. And then the third poem, and this is around the time where I'm going to stop because this is where my last class pretty much stopped. It's about Emily Dickinson. And you'll notice that in the notes below, I've got not only the links to the poems we're reading, but from the Poetry Foundation, a sampling of Dickinson's poetry. She wrote over 1,000 poems, actually. And I have to admit, somewhat sheepishly, I was never the biggest fan of Emily Dickinson, but it's only over time that I've come to appreciate her. I think one of the reasons why I didn't like her is because initially when I was a student, I didn't quite understand her. And then when I realized that the scholars too grapple with understanding Dickinson, she wrote very personal poetry for herself, not necessarily to be published. So oftentimes it's very difficult to decipher what it was that she was trying to say. In the notes below, I've given you a biography of Emily Dickinson. It's 56 minutes long, so you don't need to see it, but if you're interested in Dickinson, it gives you a good overview of her life. And even though it's a bit dated, from 1987, it quotes a good amount of Dickinson poetry, so it's a nice overview of her poetry. And some of the points I can say about her poems is that her poetry reveals, but it also conceals. There's many questions in her poems as there are answers. And she had a very unorthodox writing style. So if you're reading Dickinson, you want to make sure you're reading the correct Dickinson. That her poetry, which she wrote for herself, was published after the fact and actually corrected by editors. And the way that they, quote, corrected it, unquote, was by making sure they put commas in places of the dashes that would have been considered grammatically incorrect and standardizing the capitalization to follow the rules of grammar. But I think it's important that we read Dickinson in the original where she's breaking all those rules. This is a defiance of convention where she uses capitals in places where we wouldn't normally use capitals, dashes, which are much longer pauses than commas, and a very flexible rhyme. So it gives a much raw, much more sense of jagged element to her poetry. And her poetry also follows the patterns of Protestant hymnals, which makes it rather subversive. Um, because she was very clear that she wasn't religious, but she was spiritual. In fact, she refused to go to church in her adulthood, which would have been very noticeable of somebody of her class, which was a rather comfortable, affluent position. Her father was a local attorney in Amherst, no less. And you can visit the Dickinson Homestead, which is now a museum in Amherst. And the mythology associated with Dickinson is just as perhaps enigmatic as her poetry, where she didn't marry, where the expectation was that she would and give different dinner parties. Instead, she lived in her father's home and basically isolated herself. Some might use the term agoraphobic, where she didn't leave the house very frequently and are a recluse. It almost reminds me of A Sorrowful Woman, but this was real life. And basically, she wrote and wrote and wrote, again, over 1,000 poems, and refused to go to church or to marry and defied lots of social conventions, even outwardly stating that she hated housework, though she did like baking. All kinds of stories about her. One that included baking is that she was once invited to a social function. She had quite a few friends, actually, because she maintained them through letter writing, almost like social media today. Was invited to a social function. Someone came to her door. She hid in her room, as she was wont to do, and behind a curtain, and opened her window and lowered a rope. And attached to the rope was a basket with baked goods and a note saying that she was sorry that she couldn't attend the social function, but please accept the baked goods in her absence. So there are many stories like this about Dickinson and her very unconventional life, which is illustrated in the unconventional poetry, where she oftentimes will pose questions of the unknowable and the relationship between invisible and visible realms. She oftentimes talks about death from the perspective of the dead and the afterlife. So even though her poetry was very personal, written for herself, it's also very universal because it deals with some of the questions that are associated with basically existence. And the biggest question, perhaps, is what happens after death. And she did oftentimes write about death, which is one of the reasons why some people don't care for Dickinson. But she didn't present death in a negative. She presented it oftentimes as a positive, as not the ending of something, but the beginning of something. Some of her themes are about loss, love, religion, nature, loneliness, defiance, and of course, death, which is the poem that we're going to talk about next class. Um, One of the poems that I do understand and that it oftentimes is anthologized is Because I Could Not Stop for Death. And she, much like Shakespeare, did not title her poems, so we reference her poems by the first line or by the number in which that poem is organized by scholars and critics. And again, I encourage you to visit the Emily Dickinson Homestead. I believe they have actually some discounts for students. And she attended college locally at Mount Holyoke. So that was a school that was a female seminary at the time, a preparatory school to help prepare females for their roles in higher society at the time period. But she also had a very thorough background in the sciences and would oftentimes merge science with spirituality. So that gives you a little bit of information about Dickinson. So I had an attendance question for today that basically I'm going to delay until our next class. So I'm going to ask the same attendance question next class so that we would have had an opportunity to have read all those poems so you can determine which poem you like best. So certainly you can go ahead and answer that question now, but I'm going to ask the very same question next class, so you could answer it now or you can answer it next class. Both would be fine by me, because what we're going to do next class is to read Because I Could Not Stop for Death, and we will also continue on with our reading of some of the other poems that I have scheduled. And you will see that some of the poems are listed as handout. That means that they are not included in the newest version of the text, but I am including links for you. So one of those poems, for instance, would be America by Allen Ginsberg. But we haven't gotten to that particular poem yet. First, we need to talk about a very iconic poem, The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. Perhaps the second most misread poem on the face of the planet, next to Shakespeare's sonnet. So I'm going to end the video here just so that I can be up to date with both of my classes and have both of the classes be at the same point. We'll pick up next class with Dickinson. And again, you can respond to the attendance question now or next class. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.